So, yes, as Lauren said, I come from Holland Bloorview Kids Rehabilitation Hospital, very long, from beautiful Toronto. And it sounds like our centre does very similar work and sees very similar people to here, just talking with social work and talking about the sort of kids you see here. So we do a lot of the same work as you do. We have a Spina-bifida clinic that meets every week from 0 to 18 and involves a multidisciplinary clinic. For the last 8 years, I've been doing research with the Spina-bifida clinic team. I'm a scientist and I've joined with them to look at what's really useful and interesting for them clinically. I'm told I talk fast, so wave at me if I do talk fast. So this is what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk a little bit about what is sexuality, what do we know about it in relation to disability, what do we know about it in terms of spina bifida specifically, and there are some new guidelines coming out, so I thought I would take you through those guidelines for across the lifespan, different things to consider at different ages. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a study I did with young people with spina bifida around sexuality, and just some sort of next steps and key ideas and thoughts to take away. I have 45 minutes, 40 minutes? Okay. You can wave at me if I'm going over. I like talking, so. So what is sexuality? So it means different things to different people. And it doesn't have to be just about having a sexual relationship with somebody, but it's also about your identity, about the way you think about yourself, the way you think about your body, how you feel about other people, health, relationships, and really who you really think you are, regardless of culture or religious beliefs, sexual orientation, or gender identity. So it encompasses quite a lot. And the World Health Organization defines it like this, that it's an integral part of your personality. So everybody is a basic need and a basic aspect of being human. What we often talk about in a medical rehab environment is sexual health, which is a bit more sort of focused. And that talks about having a positive and respectful approach to sexuality and sexual relationships, the possibility of having pleasurable and safe experiences, free of coercion, discrimination, and violence, obviously key. And especially, I think, when we think about in a disability environment where kids with disabilities can be more protected and sheltered, that I think this is actually a really key point to think about how we best prepare our kids for growing up and having those healthy relationships and reduce the risk of that sort of any negative and coercive kind of relationships. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. So, why is it important to talk about it? We don't all like talking about it. It can be difficult sometimes, but why should we talk about it? Newsflash, people with disabilities do have sex. This is a couple in Toronto who have set up their own centre for information. Has anyone heard of the Rose Centre? No? So it's a young man with CP who's married to a wife without a disability, and they set up this centre to talk specifically about support and information for people who have disabilities and around sexuality and sex education. So very, very cool. So we really do need to talk about it. So in terms of sexuality, what do we actually know about disability specifically and how the two interact? So we know that young people with disabilities have exactly the same hopes and desires for sex and relationships than those without disabilities. And we know that the age of first sexual encounter doesn't differ for youth with disabilities. However, parents and healthcare professionals often don't recognize sort of the importance of talking about sexuality with young people with disabilities. And I think it's fairly universally sort of accepted that there's a lot of belief out there that people with disabilities are asexual. They don't have the same sexual needs, health, desires around relationships as well. And it's often really sort of not talked about. the thing that got me really interested in this topic is a young woman who comes to our centre. And she's a young adult now, but she comes back and volunteers. And she told me at school they had their sex ed classes, and she was told to leave because she would never need it. So, pause for effect. So that's what really got me into this, the interest in this, to say about actually literature research says that we really do need to include it, and our assumptions are often false. And young people with disabilities do report not receiving sort of enough and sufficient information. Now, what about spina bifida, as we're here to talk about? So, although the previous slide said, youth with disabilities generally don't think they have enough sex education, when people have asked people with spina bifida, they often say, yeah, general sex education was fine, but they never really held. They had very little education specific to their spina bifida. We know they're interested in sexuality, we know they're interested in fertility, we know they're interested in romantic relationships. We've had many surveys and information has actually been done with young people with spina bifida, interestingly. And we can see here 2/3 of youth were worried about intimate relationships. And less than a half said that they had had spina bifida specific kind of education that was adequate. So we know there's a real gap there. It's interesting that, where do kids get their sex education? From friends, from, well, these days, online, from school, from parents, probably less down the line, but none of us really feel that it's our job, right? Everyone goes, well, I haven't had the training, or it's not up to me, or I don't know enough, or, because it's difficult to talk about. So, that all kind of combines to the fact that actually many of our kids don't have the access to the information as possible, which is sort of an equal opportunity issue as well. Talking about incontinence is actually really key to this, and I'm going to talk quite a lot about incontinence on a talk of sexuality, because it comes in again and again with the research. Okay. All right, so this is the interactive bit, so don't let me down. So what issues do you see when you see in your clinics, in your daily life, relating to spina bifida and sexuality? Are there any key sort of issues that you see repeatedly? Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. So there's sort of access to that. And I think some of it's also privacy as well, having that space as well to sort of talk about it. Yes. Yeah. 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 We'll talk definitely about that as well. Yes. Mm-hmm.
And then I'm using these results to comment on, well, in your case, I think this and that, and you should do this. Then we know, and maybe we'll talk about that, or at least I think that not everybody's the same, so I can have a certain vision, a certain level, and I can think that perhaps from a sexual point of view, this and that may work or not, but I'm not quite sure, because really everybody's unique,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't have a test.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like I tell a boy, go in and show me you have an erection, and or you don't, and then I know it's objective.
Yes.
And talk about it. So, and some people, depending on their own life, they either, experienced a few things or not. So it's kind of tricky to first ask questions, like, do you know whether this or that, and then, okay, so I'm using that info back, and then I'm talking to you regarding your own situation because I use what you just told me.
Yep.
But sometimes they don't know what to tell me.
Yeah.
It's uncomfortable to ask because they may not be there yet. So it's tricky.
Yeah. so many issues that are kind of interact. So we've got the sort of physical pieces, we've got some of the psychological pieces or the psychosocial pieces. So this is sort of a very, I mean, there's many more, but these are sort of some of the common ones. So things, so incontinence and the sort of behavior, the urinary tract and so on. We have sensation, may have differing or lacking sensation. You've got things from lack of privacy, so even having the opportunity for young people to be on their own and actually engage in any kind of exploration as well. Latex allergy, if we're talking about contraception, and many other things. So it's complex, and they sort of all interact. And as you say, they're all grey areas, and will differ from person to person. So these are, they haven't even been published yet, so you are the first to hear about them. The Spina-bifida Association in the States is just about to issue 25 new guidelines that cover a huge range of topics, all evidence-based, with recommendations. And there are 4 around sexual health and sexuality. So we have men's and women's, we have sexual health, and then precocious puberty is a bit more around endocrine, but I thought 4 out of the 25 are on this, which is kind of a really interesting development. So they will be out soon for those of you who want to use it in practice. So I just want to go through the things that they recommend for the different life stages, and I think we often don't think of sexuality early enough. So this is one of my messages, is to think from the start of the child's life. So they emphasize in the very young ones, really it's about facts for parents, to talk about some of the neurological outcomes in spina bifida and how that might affect later down the line, sort of sexual function, to make sure to emphasize that sexual exploration is just a normal and healthy part of childhood, and obviously ongoing. And just in the early years, it's about, appropriate and inappropriate touch. So you're empowering that young person to be aware of these things, especially when a lot of self-care is given to young people as well, to have conversations around that. And then to explore for sensation, and this is just generally about kind of just feeling good in your body and knowing your body. It's not really about sex at this point of view. And then also to talk to parents about continence and how important continence management is for later sexual satisfaction and relationships, because we know that there is quite an association between them. And then to educate the parents to look for signs of precocious puberty, so before 8 years of age. So these are just they're just touch points that I'm going to give you, just sort of a few examples, and there's lots more information in the guidelines if anyone's interested. So thinking quite early in life about it. And then so for those mid-years, we sort of, again, is education for the parents, but also, getting them to encourage the child to ask questions. To your point, we're not used to talking about it or raising that. So being able to raise it in consultations in an age-appropriate way, of course, can be like a really good practice, and to model that for parents, and then parents to be able to do that at home as well. And discussing sort of sexual diversity in an appropriate manner. I think when we think sexuality, I know I do. I think we all often think in a what we call heteronormative way, so that if someone is sexual, it's in a heterosexual way, and that's often how we talk about it, between man and woman. And so talking about early that diversity, about gender identity and sexual orientation, again in an age-appropriate way, but just in a very neutral manner, can be really helpful from the beginning. And then this advocate for school education. As my little story earlier said, I'm really passionate about this, to make sure that kids are included in those sessions at school, that they're not excluded. So they're at least getting the basic sexual education, and that might be then enhanced at clinic or through parents, talking about the spina bifida thing, the specific. Continence management, underscoring the importance of that. And again, the exploration, totally healthy and normal, and providing that privacy. So that by the time they are in their terrible teens, obviously we know this is a time where actually this topic becomes, really quite important for young people, with increasing independence and that identity development. Sexual orientation often comes around this time, body image. They want to form peer relationships at least, and maybe romantic relationships. So, you know, a lot of the guideline is around just acknowledging sexuality as a part of life, very normal, typical part of life, if people, that's what people want. Around, you know, how we discuss healthy relationships, again, in that sort of gender-neutral language. And some of the same things, but also around contraception, you know, latex-free, also around sexual health screening. We know people with disabilities generally have very low rates of general health screening, often because they're not being seen by general practitioners in the community, and often it's not thought about. So again, talking about sort of self-examination, as well as making sure that people are getting the sexual screening and other health screening that any other typical person would have. And of course, when they start thinking about reproduction or future, they're talking about folic acid, risks of spina bifida, and so on, around pregnancy. Now, often that's where it stops, but of course, you know, there are adults with spina bifida, many adults who often get left out of these discussions. So again, for adulthood, really the guidelines are really around, again, acknowledging sexuality as part of life, screening, self-examination, folic acid contraception. It's all on a continuum. It's a development and growth. And then the last thing, though, is interesting, is around communication with partners and with other people. Had an interesting conversation at the break about this, about how to talk with partners about these issues, because it can be hard, right? So that's where I want to go on to next, and this is the study that I did. So we're kind of going back to young adults now, and you know, talking about sexuality and you know, how a partner can provide pleasure, or as a couple you can have pleasure. You know, these are difficult. We all most of us find those difficult to talk about anyway. But with disability as well, that adds an extra layer of sort of complexity often. And so what I wanted to know was, young people, how can we as healthcare professionals better prepare young people with spina bifida to have these conversations, to talk about sexuality and disability, either in sort of romantic relationships or sexual relationships. So this was our study, and this really came from a study we did actually first on incontinence, where this came up, and we were like, oh, that's interesting. So that's when we did a study specifically on sexuality. So it's a study I did a couple of years ago with an adolescent medicine fellow. It was 11 young adults with spina bifida. They didn't have to have had a sexual relationship to be part of it, because we were also interested in other aspects and healthy relationships. We just wanted to know, how do young people think about and discuss, or plan to discuss, or are worried about discussing with a partner around the spina bifida and sort of and relationships. So I'm sure no one is interested in the methods, but if anyone is interested, I will tell you afterwards. But basically we did individual interviews, so what we call qualitative research. So we got them to tell the stories, tell me about a time when, what do you think about, and let them sort of tell us their thoughts about different experiences they had. The only reason I put this up is just to show that we had heterosexual people, but also bisexual, and people who identified as queer or homosexual as well. And some had romantic relationships, some had sexual relationships, some hadn't. So we had a real mix. It wasn't just from one particular sort of group of people. So this is the more interesting stuff, what people actually said. So they talked about the importance of disclosure and their concerns and worries about it. They talked about what had happened once they had disclosed that they had disability to their partners, and they talked a lot about how they did not feel prepared. And so I always think it's interesting to actually see or hear the words that they used. And so Cameron, you know, some people said, well, it's part of me, it's completely, you know, my spina bifida is part of me, why wouldn't I talk about it? You know, very much part of their identity. And then other people like Kevin generally said, well, I've never had a problem. I don't think it affects me at all, and so why would I? And so there was a real sort of mix, and it really depended on how they had sort of integrated that disability into their identity. I say none of these are right or wrong. This is just people's experiences. So when they were really quite concerned about talking to their partner, either that they had any disability or spina bifida specifically, or what they needed from their partner to make sure that it was a pleasurable experience. They worried about timing, like when do I say anything? And they also were really worried about being rejected because of it. So this is Rachel. So Rachel talks about sort of this idea of like trust. Trust was fundamental. There had to be trust there before they disclosed any information. So she talks about sort of she doesn't say anything until she gets really close to someone, and then she talked about only if necessary, which was interesting. So that they might see the scar on her back, and she'd have to explain why she had from surgery, or also around incontinence. So with the concern, they may have a incontinent episode whilst having sex, and some people said it's better to tell them up front in case that happens, and other people said, well, if it does happen, then I'll tell them. So I'm not sure I would recommend that. But Lewis definitely said, I'll prepare them first just in case. So I think we'll go with Lewis's idea. But, you know, that's how people felt. They were so concerned and anxious and worried about it. So I absolutely, you know, understand that. And interestingly, you know, because they talked a lot about fears of rejection. If I tell my partner I have spina bifida, they may not then want to either be with me or sleep with me. Something I've wanted so much, they may just, you know, reject me. And in fact, it was interesting. Lewis talked about, he said, I always expected someone to freak out on me, and no one ever did. So it was interesting to hear some positive experiences that could then maybe be used with young people to talk about. So in terms of what happened afterwards, after they talked to it, these are those who sort of talked about, well, when I told my my boyfriend about it, you know, he was pretty cool. And it gave her a lot of confidence in herself that she had been accepted by her partner. We did hear a lot of positive responses. That may be just people who had had positive experiences wanted to take part in the study. But we were interested that there were a lot of positive experiences people told us about. And then, yeah, this idea that, you know, they really did not feel prepared to have these conversations at all, and raise this idea of, well, as a girl, it would have been amazing if I had been encouraged to explore myself, my body, my sensation beforehand. We maybe talk to boys a little more about that, but so, you know, so the idea of like kind of preparing girls and boys from an early age, which links back to the guidelines I was talking about. So it's interesting how they kind of really line up. So in terms of overall, I mean, rejection and fear of rejection is part of day-to-day life. We all experience it and all have, especially if we think back when we were teenagers. I'm sure we could all probably think of a time when we didn't want to be rejected, even by friends or other romantic partners. But it can be heightened when there's a disability involved, because there is stigma with a disability. You know, unfortunately, we can't deny it, and so we still need to do a lot of advocacy in the community around that. Incontinence is a very key concern. We know it's, like from the quantitative research, we know it's linked to sexual relationships and satisfaction. And I like this idea of a disclosure script. And by that, I kind of mean that they had practiced what they were going to say to their partner. They had some words that they felt comfortable saying and had maybe practiced with, maybe on their own or maybe with a friend, so that by the time they said it to a partner, they felt more comfortable with it. And that actually made the relationship more intimate. Not all of the participants felt the need to talk about their spina bifida with their sexual partner, and that's also okay. That's fine. You know, everyone's completely different. So that's sort of the study, and as I say, it kind of links with the guidelines. So I thought, like, what are the key takeaways from this work? So we talk about the medical community can help empower young people with spina bifida in regards to their sexual health. I think we can definitely, I think we would all agree, basically in that. But I think as healthcare providers, we need to be empowered ourselves as well before we can do that with our young people. Because we often don't know how to talk about it. Just at lunchtime, talking to a few people, you know, well, clinic's running late, and you know, I've got 10 other things to talk about with this family or this young person, and you know, or I don't feel I have any training in it, or am I the best person to talk about that? I'm only a insert physiotherapist, occupational therapist, nurse, whoever. You know, we often think it's someone else's job, and that's fine, and that's what we all do for difficult topics. So I think we need to think for healthcare professionals, what can we do, but what do we need also to be able to empower our young people? So here are some things I kind of gathered from the work. So I think talking about sexuality from an early age is important in age-appropriate ways, but to encourage people to be comfortable with their bodies and their body image and their self-esteem and identity. You know, it's all kind of packaged into one. You can't remove that away from sort of the sexuality piece. And then providing support to help developing an understanding of their spina bifida. We were interested that some of the people we interviewed didn't know what type of spina bifida they had. And we just thought that was interesting. These were people in their 20s, and you know, that in order to explain it to someone else, you know, sort of need to be sort of more, you need to be comfortable and know about it yourself. So as healthcare providers, when we're working with children and young people about developing that confidence for them, because when they're younger, it's probably telling their friends, if they want to, you know, and then as they grow old, it's giving them the foundation or the building blocks then to explain it to a partner later on. This was an interesting one we talked about routinely asking parents to leave the room. And I know a lot of you do that already, and I think that's awesome. But it's making sure it's routine, because it also gives them the opportunity to practice their skills in communicating with the physician, about advocating for themselves, to be able to ask for what they want without necessarily their parents there. And I know we sometimes say, oh, do you want your parents to leave the room? But then the young person isn't going to say yes, because then their parents are going to say, what are they going to talk about? So I think as healthcare professionals, we can help them and just get parents out of the room. So you can have, and it may not be the discussion about sex they're worried about, it might be something else, but it gives them the space to be able to, and I know we would all like to do that in an ideal world, and we can't always do that, but this is sort of in an ideal world, this is what we would do. Again, this idea of discussing sensation, exploration, talking about continence and link with other aspects of life, and helping young people develop that script so they can feel comfortable. So just kind of, you know, really kind of bringing it into as a routine aspect of our consultations and of our discussions with young people. I keep using young people because we're in a pediatric rehab center, but obviously a lot of these are kind of, because the knock-on effect is for when people become adults, and you know, trying to give them the skills in childhood and young people so they can use them into adulthood. So this is new as well. So this is something we're doing that I'm excited about. I have an interest in developing resources for healthcare professionals, but not just them, about how to talk about difficult topics. So my other interest that I work on is about weight and how we can have positive weight-related conversations with children and young people, and about healthy lifestyles and doing it in a very non-judgmental way. And we've developed this framework about that healthcare professionals can kind of ask themselves when planning some of these conversations about, well, who should be part of that conversation? Should it be mum? Should it be youth on their own? Should it be the aunt who looks after them after school, which might be relevant when it's weight and feeding and food? But who should be part of that conversation about sexuality? When should I bring it up? How do I bring it up? What do I say? What words do I use? How can I really engage my client in these conversations, and what techniques have been recommended? And that's things like motivational interviewing or solution-focused coaching, or those sort of specific techniques. But this is from our weight resource that we have developed. It's free and online. It has things, it's really practical. It has things like sentence starters. So I'm giving you the words that you can try and practice, and then you'll make it your own and whatever. So if we don't know how to bring up a topic, it has sort of cards that you could use to find out what the people are interested in. So we're taking that model and we're hoping to adapt it for sexuality, and having how healthcare professionals can have discussions about sexuality, sexual health with children and young people when they feel they might not have the training or the comfort level to do it. So just giving you some words, giving you some things to actually try and use. So we're in the process of, we're going to be interviewing healthcare professionals, we're going to be interviewing young people and their parents, and saying, well, what do you want? What do you want your healthcare provider to talk about? How do you want them to talk about it? And from physicians or nurses or doctors, you know, like, what are you worried about? What's the bit you find really difficult? How can we make your life easier by giving you some very simple, practical resources? And as I mentioned, scripts. So we might include some scripts in this toolkit. We use a lot of simulations. I don't know if you use it often with medical education. I don't know if there's any other here you've seen simulations. So you have a professional actor as the client and the professional, and they do a scene in front of it, and then you debrief it and so on, and they can be really good teaching tools. So these are some of the things we're doing. We did actually a review of websites for youth with disabilities about sexuality over the summer. I had a summer student do it, and they're really not very good at all. We did a quality rating of them. So we're also hoping to look at that a bit further and pick some of the higher quality ones and see if there's something we could either add on, because we don't want to just redo all the work, but is there a way we can enhance what's already there? But also being able to say to healthcare professionals, here are 3 really good quality websites you could point people to. So we want to do the hard work for you. So just acknowledging people in my team that have all contributed to this. Thank you, and very open to discussing anything.